Excluding the 2 days ago,
Yeah.
was it yesterday?
Hi everyone, we'll be starting the event in about 5 minutes, so it'll be good if everybody finds a seat and make yourself comfortable. Thank you. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our event. My name is Jody and I'm from SGInnovate. And for those of you who are not familiar with SGInnovate, we actually believe that Singapore has the resources and capabilities to solve hard problems through the use of deep tech. And part of our efforts to strengthen the community is through knowledge sharing events such as the one that you're here for today. So today we're very happy to be collaborating with our longtime partner, Entrepreneur First, for our second edition of the From Lab to Market series. Without further ado, I'll pass the time over to Felicia from Entrepreneur First to give her introduction. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So it's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Felicia, and I work for the talent acquisition team in EF. So what do we do? EF runs a 6-month-long program. It's a full-time, full-commitment program for individuals who want to start companies from scratch. We have here on the panel Tommaso, Shabnam. They built their companies out of EF. So they joined the program, and 6 months later, they had their company, and now they are doing amazingly. Yeah, so a little bit more about our program. We bring on board researchers, scientists, product builders, maybe you're a software, hardware engineer, as well as industry experts. You could be from the legal sector, you could have worked in construction, you name it. We bring on board people from across all industries. They meet in the program, and during the first 3 months of the program, you find a co-founder as well as form a commercially viable idea that we will eventually fund if we find your team strong and your idea strong. So yes, if you'd like to learn more about what we do at EF, feel free to approach me later on, or Tiffany, who's sitting right here. We're in purple shirts. Feel free to talk to Shabnam and Tommaso about the experience in the program, or feel free to just visit our website, joinef.com. So our next program begins in July 2019, this year. If you are interested, our applications are open, so feel free to go online and submit your application form there. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. With a small group like this, it gives us a very good opportunity to be very interactive. So, I'll ask some questions, but if at any point you have a question that kind of follows on along with the discussion, feel free to raise your hand and kind of jump in and get as much out of the discussion as you can. I also don't typically like mics, but I've got a little bit of a cold, so my voice is a little bit deeper and sexier than usual, so we'll use the mic for this evening. To get us started, maybe to help get a little bit of a feel for the crowd, students, okay, startups, couple, corporates, researchers, investors. Okay, very good, excellent. That kind of, everybody looks around when the investor question comes up. Okay, excellent. So, with that, I'm Jeremy from SGInnovate. I'm part of our venture building team. And very basically, we look to, one, help build deep tech companies from scratch at some point. So working with very technical founders, so kind of like Horizon Quantum Computing, and building, the company from there and supporting them once the funding comes along, and then also with other companies acting as a more deeply involved investor. So I just want to kick off the conversation with an introduction from our panelists. So maybe tell us a few minutes about what you're currently working on, and maybe go in a little bit about the initial journey of how you got there from an academic background.
Should I start? Okay. Thank you, Jeremy. Hello, everyone. My name is Tommaso, and maybe before I jump into myself and telling you a bit more about my journey, there's one more question I would like to ask the audience. How many of you are actually familiar with the idea of quantum computing? I know some of you are because I can recognize a few faces, but can you raise your hand if you have heard of it? Oh, hi. Okay, so I see a lot of shy hands. Don't be shy, maybe a little bit more like. Okay, few ones. The reason why I'm asking this is because even when I give talks to the public, I'm always very interested in understanding why people are actually here. Because this is a bit of an unusual panel, I might say. So it's always very nice for me to get a sense of why people are coming, what do they actually want to learn, and how we can, share information in a better way. So it's nice to see that somebody's familiar with the concept. It's even nicer to see that some of you seem not to have heard of it before, so that's great. Going back to myself, I'm Italian originally. I moved to Singapore in 2014. My background is in physics, in quantum information theory, and I used to work down the road at the Center for Quantum Technologies together with Seaway as a postdoc in quantum computing. At the beginning of 2018, so kind of a year and a half ago, I joined Entrepreneur First together with a fellow friend of mine, also physicist, and we launched the company Entropica. So our goal is to take what we have studied for many years, which is quantum computing, and do something useful with it, but not only useful, something that could be revolutionary and really game-changing. So our application is biology, in particular molecular biology. What we want to do is to understand better what happens when it comes to the processes of life, and then how can we use that for drug development. So I'll pass it to Shabnam.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. As Felicia mentioned, in fact, I'm still in the incubation program in EF, so I don't have a company yet, so I'm trying to build one. I am a physicist, by education I'm a physicist. I mainly work on simulation of quantum systems, different quantum systems. And I have been a researcher for about 10 years, the past five years here in Center for Quantum Technologies, the same institute as Tommaso and Sehu. But I would say in the past 2 years, I've been feeling that I need a change. I think being in a specific industry for about 10 years, in fact, feeling that you need to move on or you need to move to a new, I would say, environment to grow further is quite normal. At least for me, it's quite natural and normal in professional life or in your personal life. So I've been having this feeling that I need to do something more. But I was not sure what I want to do, and it was not easy for me to move out from academia because I really love research and I really love physics. So I didn't want to give away that. And it happened that I had some opportunities to join some startup companies to work for them, but still I couldn't convince myself until late last year when Entrepreneur First, people from Entrepreneur First contacted me, and they talked to me, and it took me quite some time to convince myself to take the step because I felt that it can, in fact, put me out of my comfort zone and help me to learn more things and learn more stuff about myself. So at the moment, from late January this year, I have joined the Entrepreneur First incubation program, and with my partner, who is a material scientist, physical chemist, material scientist, we are also working on application of quantum computing because I think quantum technology is now at the stage that can somehow move out from academia and come into industry. We are going to see the applications and use cases further and further as we go on. So we have decided to work on application of the quantum computing in design and development of new type of materials. For the moment, I cannot give more, detail because, honest with you, still ourselves, we are working on the detail to make it specific, exactly what type of materials, what use cases. But since the first use cases of quantum computers are going to be in quantum chemistry and material sciences, we decided to work on that direction. So, thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming. Yeah. So I'm Sihui. So I'm from Singapore. I've studied abroad in physics, and that's where my technical degree is in. I'm currently working in Horizon, which I feel really privileged to be in because basically the founder, Joe Fitzsimmons, we are in the seed. We were post-seed funding round. We were very close. We already got the seed funding. We're post-seed, and I just joined about 2 weeks ago. And we're getting started. I'm handling things like setting up the office, getting the plan out, and working on stuff. So it's quite a journey. So like Shapna and Tommaso, I came from CQT, and I think from academia to industry is a really big step. And like Shapna, I'm also very attached to my research. I've loved it, and I've loved physics since I was a kid. So stepping away from it, I think the change in mentality was very important. So it's like, well, it's not really giving away what I like. It's actually finding new opportunities to apply what I like to what I can do, and then changing the world, right? So especially with the stimulus in the what's going on currently in the world is that there's this critical point where a lot of academics, people I know, have been pushed to step out of their comfort zone and start companies. So I'm very encouraged by that, and I was also discouraged by the fact that in academia you are actually encouraged to do one thing and one thing only very, very well, and then if your portfolio is so specific and so specialized that you're an expert in that area, then a university will hire you for that area. Whereas I'm a person who likes to do many things, and I'm very adaptable. I love to get my hands dirty in the lab, like do stuff, cook things, or try new stuff. And I've been given the criticism that I do many things for academic. And I think some of that is, maybe if I had tried a little longer, I might have gotten a position. I don't want to wait that long. And I think the time is good to step away from my comfort zone and actually do something useful.
Okay, so thank you. So certainly, a bit of information about some of the personal motivations and the personal aspects to the journey so far. From a technology and timing perspective in particular, maybe what were some of the things that you either kind of saw on the horizon, to use a bit of a pun, or that created a little bit of the tipping point with respect to the readiness of the technology and where you saw it going, that encouraged you to make that transition, now, right? So there's a lot of still open questions around quantum computing and when the big universal quantum computers will get here. So what were some of the signs that you saw that told you that now was the time?
Sure. So there's a very good question. I didn't mention that earlier, but my background is theoretical physics, which, if you have the idea of the physicist working in the lab doing stuff, that was not me. It was very different. You have like a whiteboard, paper, and that's it. And also working for many years on quantum computing in that way is fun, of course, and you think a lot about the problems, but it can become very abstract and a bit sterile. Then things changed radically a couple of years ago when literally in a week, IBM put the first quantum computer. It was a very small, noisy, rudimental, not so great quantum machine, but it was a processor available on the cloud, meaning you could just use your browser, connect to it, you had 5 qubits in your hands, and you could actually do something that it was pretty much out of your league until the day before. Because if we wanted to test anything related to our research, you had to go find a group, maybe in Oxford, maybe, I don't know, in the US somewhere, decide with them a plan, wait 6 months for the qubits to be stable, blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden, you actually had something that you could test easily, freely, with great documentation, and it was free for everyone. And there was a huge change, right? Because then you see a big company that is investing a lot of money in the technology to say, look, we have something, everyone can use it, go, play with it, and try to do something useful with it. And then after they did that, the whole ecosystem started to change really quickly. New companies came out of the woods. Then we found that like Intel, Honeywell, to name one, for example, there is a bit of an unusual one. Google, Microsoft, all these big names are all pushing heavily on the technology. And they're releasing more and more and more software and ideas and algorithms on the web so that people can play with it. And that's really, you can see a shift of something that was very theoretical, very abstract, very university-driven, to something that now is very industry-driven. And this is nice. When technology starts to be industry-driven is really when it changes. There's another point which is interesting. Since quantum computing has applications in the military as well, it becomes a key technology for all the big, let's say, powers around the planet, which means that there is a lot of money poured into it from the US and from Europe, and now also from China, which creates a feedback loop so that all the other countries put more money, so that puts more money, and then the other country puts more money. This is also, forget about the geopolitical implication, but from an industry point of view, it's very important, because it means there is a real drive to actually make this happen, and there's a bit of an arms race. So to keep the answer brief, I think the quantum experience by IBM was really the tipping point that said, this actually works, this can be done, and it can be used by everyone.
I would say, most of the things that Tommaso mentioned, I think would be the same, the same motivation for us, but specifically for me, because for my PhD thesis, I worked on the theory of qubits, on performance of the qubits, in fact, superconducting qubits. So that was a time when people were working on single qubits, how to design the pulse, how to design the qubits, very simple designs. And then some years later, in fact, I moved away from the superconducting devices for a while. I've been working on a different field. You suddenly see that, like I had this experience myself, that you can just hold one actual quantum processor in your hand, and you realize that it is happening. It's not at the theoretical stage anymore. In fact, the technology is coming out. It's coming out from the lab into in fact, at the stage that you can start using it for the industry. And on the other hand, since I already do simulations, for my research, I do simulations, I know the power of simulations. So that was also another motivation for me. And as physicists, we know that just translating the problems and, in fact, building applications and softwares to use quantum computers is not trivial yet, maybe not trivial yet. So it doesn't make sense to have, in fact, hardware ready, but we don't have any software or any application ready to use that hardware. So I think the progress in developing the hardware and also the software should be in parallel. Because otherwise, if we have a universal quantum computer fully working, sitting somewhere in the lab or available by one of these big companies, then what if we don't have any application to run on it? It doesn't really make sense. So that was also another, I would say, motivation for me to start thinking about thinking about applications, translating the problems that we have into in the industry in a way that we can run them on the quantum computers and hopefully make the best out of this technology.
While Sapna is talking, I realized that I forgot to say what Horizon does. So Horizon Quantum Computing, which is my company, we basically, because of the existence of hardware now that's coming out, and we are from the algorithm side. I've been working on quantum algorithms. So what we do is to bridge the gap where, okay, we have this hardware coming out, but then normal people wouldn't be able to talk about it. And then, I spent 10 years of my life getting a physics degree, two physics degrees, trying to understand quantum mechanics, and I still don't understand it. And Feynman has famously, I think Feynman famously said, right, if you say you understand quantum mechanics, you actually haven't understood it, which is a very good way of saying that. So what we do is Horizon is building a stack, a compiler, where it's a very ambitious plan, but we are going to talk to the hardware directly, and then have a wrapper around it, but then going beyond that and connect it to a data structure so that it will connect to normal programs like C and Python. And in this way, people who would like to use the hardware and find ways of making it, there are more people to help with finding the applications, which, that without actually learning quantum mechanics, spending 10 years to get a degree in quantum mechanics. I guess, I guess your question was why...
why now?
Why now, yeah. Because the hardware is a really big motivation. Yeah, it shows you what is possible. When I did my PhD, when I started my undergrad, you're going to know how old I am. My PhD, and I finished my undergrad degree in 2004, and I was looking at topics to do my PhD in. So I was in the A-star scholarship, and I was in the US. So at the time, quantum computing was just in this upward slope because Peter Shaw at MIT, I think when he discovered that he was in the AT&T labs, there was this Shaw factorization, which is a really fast speed up to factor large numbers into its prime factors, and this is like the basis for RSA. So DARPA, DOE, like military applications, right? Like basically to break encryption is like, wow, all right, we better get our ass on this and then get a handle on it and see if we can, stop it or at least have a way of protecting data, right? That could become unsafe when quantum computers are actually in existence. And I thought, 2005, well, quantum computing is still fairly theoretical. And I think the general feeling then at MIT, where I was doing a PhD, it's not really going to surface, right? So Isaac Chuang had like 7 NMR qubits, and then, wow, he did 15. Oh my God, that's a big step, right? And now we're talking about 70 qubits from Rigetti and Google. So I think that push is like, it's just showing you what's possible, right? Like if you watch Star Trek, you have this motivation, well, I have a flip phone, right? Amazing magic, right? Same thing, we see what's possible, and then as physicists, and I think for a lot of techies, geeks, nerds, whatever, you want to see that happen. So I think that's at least for me, the biggest motivation.
I was going to say on understanding quantum mechanics, you're allowed to say you both understand and don't understand.
Yes.
I'm curious, could you explain what's the current state of quantum computers? I was intrigued to this talk on, you said the market will realize back. I haven't been following. What is the state of hardware and software? What do you actually do with it? I know that military tries to use it to encrypt.
Yeah, well, I mean, the basic question is looking for kind of what's the state of the moment with respect to quantum computing and software. So what can actually be done, what can't be done. So, I mean, I think I'll just kind of orient my next couple of questions to start to answer that a little bit. So, I mean, I think the investments from IBM, Google, Microsoft, others, one, kind of catalyzed some of the startup movement and seeing that money being spent in industry. It also, I think, formulated a little bit more comfort within the venture capital community and actually really seeing some serious effort there on the large industry side. So on the other end of industry, when you go out to talk to companies about what can be done, what can't be done, what's your experience been there? How have you looked at like the applications that you see that can actually work now? How do they work now? And we'll get into some stuff that will follow on a little bit more, but kind of your experience in having some of those conversations with industry at the moment.
Okay, so this is an interesting one. I think a nice way to start is to keep in mind that history repeats itself. And in a way, the kind of conversations that I'm having, or we are having, are very similar to the conversations that, if you go back and read about the history of computing, people were having at the time. We have this massive, in the 40s and the 50s, you have this massive machine that does a lot of noise, and it's very hard to understand how it actually works. And people were wondering, what can you actually do with it? I mean, Watson from IBM he was actually thinking that there was no space for computers, what we today call computers, in industry. They were fancy machines, but they had such limited applications that he said, who knows if this is true or if this is just like an imaginary quote or apocryphal quote, but he said that there is space for like 5 or maybe 10 computers on the planet. Right. But now maybe one of us has 5 computers on himself or herself today. So that quote kind of went out of the window. And it is very interesting. To me, it shows that it's very hard to imagine applications when the technology is not there yet. And even when the technology is there, it's difficult to imagine what is going to happen in the next 5 years. Okay, let's go back to quantum computing. Let's go back to what people actually ask me when I go and talk to them. There is a bit of a misconception. Well, it's not really a misconception. It's something that made sense in the past, but I think today we should start looking beyond that. This idea that quantum computers can help you to solve computations faster, whatever that means. That's fine. I don't think that fully captures the extent of what quantum computers can actually do. The way we really like to think about quantum computers is to capture complexity. Then if you start thinking about complex problems that are very complex data, you will realize that there are not so many domains today that need that kind of computing power. And this is very important, because if you want to sell a technology, you need to talk to people who have a real need for a new computing paradigm. We are very much intrigued and fascinated by the application of quantum computing in biology because the data is intrinsically complex. Even if you just look at what happens at the molecular level in a cell, it's so complicated that today nobody simulates a cell. You know, when people speak about genomics, they look at the genome, which is just a small part of what happens in a cell. But this is really a tiny part, a tiny chapter in the story. So what can we do with quantum computers in the near future? For us, the answer to that, there are many answers, but the answer we are looking at is machine learning. Again, machine learning is a bit of an abused word. So even there, one has to be very careful what he or she means about it. But the idea is, can we take the models of machine learning that today don't work? So forget about the ones that work very well. Forget about deep neural networks. Forget about supervised learning. That works fine. Let's look beyond that. Let's look at unsupervised machine learning. Imagine you throw at a machine a lot of complex biological data and you ask the machine, can you find patterns there where we are not able to guide the machine because we don't know what the patterns are? It's not like recognize a cat and a dog. It's different. Well, that's hard. This is very hard. And we see a huge potential for the technology to be applied to these kind of problems. Problems that are highly complex in nature. They use data which is very highly dimensional and heterogeneous. And also the kind of problems that today people don't try to solve because they know is hopeless with current classical computation. So to try to summarize what I just said, we see a huge potential in, let me call it next generation machine learning, going beyond what we know how to do well today. Applications on very complex problems. To give you a bit, to tell you a bit more what I'm thinking, I see 2 big domains, finance and biology, because they have very similar data structures. And look at the problems that people today don't try to solve. This is my hint, or where quantum computing can really play a role in the near future.
Okay, I just talk a little bit about the hardware. I mean, at what stage the hardware is. I mean, if we look at the latest version of the quantum computer released by IBM, which they call it IBM quantum system Q1 or system 1, something like that. It has like 20 qubits. So the point is that the reality is that at the moment they have quite few qubits. Of course, we want way more than 20 qubits or even 70 qubits. And still these systems, especially these systems made of solid state or superconductors, are quite noisy. So you cannot run very long circuits on them because they will lose their quantumness very quickly. But the point is that, first of all, we see the potential and we see the rate in which these systems are improving. That's one of the motivations for us to keep working on the applications. And the other thing is that scientists are coming up with new algorithms where you can use the current noisy small quantum computers in fact, in a hybrid, I would say, system using quantum computers and classical computers to solve some problems, like some of the machine learning problems or some of the optimization problems. You still can, you know, it's not that very soon we are going to throw away classical computers. They're quite good and they're working very well for many problems. And they should, of course, help us to improve quantum computers as well. So at the moment, I would say the hardware and the processors are quite small with few qubits and a bit noisy. You cannot run applications on them for long time, but still you can, in fact, put them in such a hybrid, I would say, collaboration or working with the classical and quantum computers together to start coming up with new type of algorithms for solving problems. But there is, I mean, apart from personally, I'm just now talking about my personal opinion, is that so far we have had solid-state processors being out there because they were quite easier to build. Because you could use just the conventional lithography methods that are used for the electronics, I mean the usual classical electronics that we have to build these superconducting circuits. But there are different platforms, different type of materials like ions, which are used to build quantum computers. Those systems are harder to handle because you have to have handle on single atoms and single ions. So it's going to take a bit longer time for those systems to come out. But I'm very hopeful that once they come out, they're going to be very successful because they have much lower noise level. And they're going to be a quite breakthrough. I don't know what's the largest number of qubits in the IonQ system. It would 107 single qubits.
And entangled, I think around 90.
90, okay. But I think that the system where they, in fact, release the report on the level of the error and the decoherence time and stuff is smaller than that, but still the level of noise is quite, you know, when you compare it with the solid-state one is, I would say, is quite interesting. And personally, I'm waiting for the ionic systems or atomic systems to come out to market.
I think Tommaso and Shapna very much answered all my questions, but yeah, I like the simulation, you know, basically doing, using, because you have quantum systems is really complex to simulate things. In the computer, it takes a long time, you know, but actually building the system itself and running it and then measuring the answer is much better if you can do if you can actually run the system, if you can build the system itself. But you can also map hard problems like MP problems, SHOP problems, you know, into Hamiltonian systems, right? So that, and then you can measure the answer from those systems. So that's like one area that I think is really hot, right?
Okay, thank you. So to build on that question a little bit more and go another level deeper, one of the questions that I ask kind of any startup, and it has an additional dimension certainly with respect to quantum computing, is what can you do now and what are your ambitions to do in the future, right? And especially as an investor, I try to be very clear about exactly what the state is now versus what the ambition is to go towards. So with respect to quantum computing in particular, you know, the very powerful universal quantum computers that are going to be able to break, you know, RSA encryption and with Shor's algorithm, et cetera, we can say are 10 to 15 years on the horizon. So the deeper level of computational power and being able to solve some of the more extremely complex, you know, whether they be biologic or financial computations, are still a little ways off. So how are you kind of looking at your roadmaps and constructing your conversations with industry and balancing those two with respect to development efforts for what can kind of be done now and the aspect of trying to get traction for investors and build up a customer base versus keeping the eye on that bigger promise for when, you know, the bigger hardware is there. So maybe we'll start at the other end of the panel this time.
because we're building quantum software for normal companies to interlace, to sort of connect to the hardware, we are building with a very close eye on the development of hardware. So as that, we are building up the compiler based on what we know about the system, but we would like to automate the process and then build the layers on top of that. So I think that would come with time, like as the hardware progresses, but ideally, as it is now, there are like these different systems, superconducting qubits, ion traps, they have different types of physical characteristics, I would say, that you have to bear in mind because they give you different types of noises. Like, for example, superconducting qubits, you have decoherences, T1 and T2 times, which essentially characterize whether or not your bits will flip, right? So in normal computing, you have like a bit flip that can happen in your memory. And then computers are so good at these days, right? You don't even need error correction to take care of it because your RAM is like super reliable. So for our stage now, we are really focusing on the existing systems, but then abstracting what we need to know from them and then building it into our compiler so that as we build it up, we will revisit it from time to time, but we wouldn't have to like rebuild everything from scratch once hardware improves because it will have to be scalable. It has to move with the applications basically. So then we have this part where the theory, as theoretical physicists, we know what algorithms can be done, and we have to keep an eye on that too. But the way we're building it is going to be ground up, and that as the algorithms move, we can meet in the middle, and then things can just smooth over quickly, like later on when the market grows.
Okay, my answer is going to be very short. I'm going to pass this question because because you know that we are very new on the idea, and it's like 2 weeks that we are working on the idea that we have chosen. Just the thing that I can mention is that, okay, my big vision is that I can start building or designing a new type of molecule, no matter how large it is. I mean, purely theoretically using simulations, like a virtual lab, and then testing it, and then suggesting it to the experimentalists to build it. So that would be the, long-term vision. But we know that with the hardware that we have now, it's not possible. But at the moment, what I can think about is working, in fact, in collaboration with experimentalists and using the data that they already have and adding some value or some improvements, like instead of simulating the whole molecule, maybe there is one specific bond in the molecule which is important, then maybe I can do some simulation on that. That's one of the challenges, in fact, that we face when you want to start building a startup and you come out of academia to, in fact, try to recognize, what you can do in short term to get something back or at least have something to present for the investors instead of having something very long term as a research plan in your mind. In fact, this was the biggest lesson that I learned in the past 2 months, and I wasted a lot of time on that, is that you should understand what is the difference between a good research plan and a good business plan. So you should always you should have a big vision for the long term, but then you should find also something in the on your way to that big vision where you can add value. So we are still working on that. I cannot give more detailed answer. Sorry.
Thank you. That's super nice. I really like what Shamnan just said. It's very important to have the big vision, but you also have to be practical. And that's fine. I think it's one of the beautiful things, going back to the previous questions, why are we doing this, why we're not in academia? Because I miss that. I miss the being practical part. It's beautiful to have vision, but it's also easy to have a vision. It's very hard to be practical. Okay, so for us, I think, linking back to this idea of vision, at some point, especially when you work with deep tech, you need to take a bet, right? You need to make certain assumptions. And while you can give yourself some room for being wrong with assumptions, it's also important to believe that certain things are going to happen. So now it's time to make some bold claims, I think. And then the claim I'm going to make is that I believe that with few hundred qubits I know we mentioned qubits a few times during the talk. If you don't know what it is, just think of it as a very vague measure of how powerful a quantum computer is. The more qubits, the more powerful it is. It's not fully true, but just bear with me for the sake of the discussion. So we believe that with few hundred qubits, people will be able to do something highly non-trivial in machine learning, not only machine learning, but for us, this is the focus. Okay, so starting with that assumption, then the second question that we ask ourselves is, when do we believe this is going to happen in a reasonable time frame? And we believe that this will happen in the next 3, let's be a bit more conservative, to 5 years, okay? So this is a reasonably long time frame for investors, but it's not crazy. And then let's try to look at what happened in the past. Let's see if we can learn something from the past. When people started to work on databases in the 80s, everyone was like, don't do that. It's a waste of time, it's going to take too long, blah, 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 the usual things that you hear. The people who started to work on database are all multimillionaires in California today because it was a great time to do that. So it's not only about vision, it's also about the timing. Then let's look at what happens in 2010. DeepMind starts and says, we are going to do these things with machine learning. Everybody laughs at them. This is not possible, blah, blah, blah. And we know what happened with DeepMind. So the point is, you need to look at the trends of what happens with the technology, and you need to believe that things will continue growing the ways that they've done for a reasonably long period of time behind you. What we have seen in quantum computing is that things are advancing fast. If the trend continues, and if ideally it accelerates, then in the next 3 to 5 years, we will reach a sweet spot where we can do something non-trivial. How do we monetize, or how do we survive until we go there? Well, there are a few ways, right? For us as a company, it's very important to understand how you actually do all these things that we want to do. It's very interesting. I mentioned databases and machine learning. Even in quantum computing, one of the big open questions is, how do you take information that belongs to the real world, to the classical world, and encode it in a way that a quantum computer can process it? So this is part of what we are working on, which is valuable per se, because this is a big question for everyone, and especially for us. How do you take biological information and encode it in a way which is quantum computing friendly? Even if this particular application is going to be useful in 5 years, still very valuable, because everyone will have to rely on such process. And then the second part of what we are doing is, assuming we have a method to encode the data, how do we write the quantum machine learning algorithms to process it? How do we work with the different quantum providers, et cetera, et cetera? So the point that I'm trying to make is that you look at the trend. If the trend is positive and if you believe in the trend, then you start building on top of that, so that when you hit the nice spot, assuming the nice spot is close enough, you can monetize huge. And even if you have to struggle for a few years, that's fine. That's perfectly reasonable. I mean, there's a long history of companies that have succeeded in that way.
Yeah. So I think the question is, I wouldn't say why does it, but maybe let's say, does it? So does the emergence of quantum computing favor startups versus incumbents? And maybe how do you see some of the dynamics playing out in that area?
This is actually a really good question. And this is a question that we get a lot, right? When investors don't know what to ask you, they're like, but what if Google is going to do the same? Right. I mean, there's a very fair question to ask, and you should have a good answer for that. But the point is that Google doesn't try to do that. Roche doesn't try to do that. Why? Because it's expensive. If Roche has to hire 100 quantum physicists tomorrow, assuming they manage to do that, it means that if the technology doesn't mature, they are stuck with 100 quantum physicists. Sorry?
They can afford it.
Sure, but then for sure you can afford a lot of things. That doesn't mean you're going to waste money. I mean, some people might do that, but in a company perspective, is a very. Let me put it this way. Let's assume you have two choices, right? One is assuming 100 quantum physicists, keep them in-house, keep them there, pay them even if they're not useful. The other one is you hire a company or you work together with a startup that has the same capabilities, is more focused, potentially has more experience, is slimmer, which means it doesn't have to go through all the bureaucratic process. Absolutely, but this is what's happening not only in quantum. This is what you see happening in most domains. You have these huge conglomerates that at the end of the day really just do the packaging of whatever they sell, and they delegate I just use R&D processes as a label. They delegate all that part, especially when it comes to deep tech, to smaller companies. It's much cheaper. It's just much cheaper. And if it works, then you acquire the company.
Yeah, I think the example of DeepMind that you touched on earlier is a little bit of a demonstration of that in the early days of machine learning. And one thing that, so Horizon Quantum Computing is working on, to some extent, democratizing the development of quantum computing algorithms for future use when the hardware is really there and ready. As it stands right now, there is a fairly limited community of people, so advanced quantum physicists, et cetera, that understand the area well enough to develop the software, to develop the hardware, to develop the algorithms and applications. So there is a little bit of a sweet spot, I would say, at the moment for startups, because it is very focused at the moment on a very limited talent pool. So if the startup is forming particularly out of that talent pool, and they have that very special knowledge base in this area, it gives them an advantage even over big money.
Can I just add a comment? It's very nice experience for me to go through this EF program, because I'm learning stuff that I don't know where else I would have learned, because you're in touch with 100 other people who are specialized in different fields. And I had the chance to talk to some people which are very good business people. And that was one of my concerns, for example, working. I mean, what if that huge company who's already developing like softwares and they are selling like millions and billions of dollars, the software, why wouldn't they do what we want to do? And there is a very simple answer. It's not going to create any revenue for them in short term. And in quantum computing is very risky at the moment, because we see that hardware is at the very earliest stages. And that's not even the case. The other way, it's even the case with the more developed technologies. Like, I have an exact example for that. Like, there are some companies which have almost the entire aerospace or other engineering industries just to sell some softwares which engineers use for design and development of different objects like airplanes and stuff. And still, these companies which sell so much, they don't do much development inside, in-house. They just acquire smaller startups, because they do, because I think the most expensive part is to develop the technology or the new software or the new application. So they wait for the smaller companies to do that, and then if it's successful, they just buy the company.
Okay, no, good. I think that was a very good question. Yeah, another question?
Not specific to quantum, but just about deep tech in general. So my emphasis is around education. We work with secondary school students and people who think more entrepreneurially about their education, as well as where they want to take the path of unfolding life. Having said that, a lot of you hear people like Jack Ma that says, well, you shouldn't be studying maths, right? Because you're never going to beat a computer. You need to be learning art and all these other sorts of things. If I look at my home country, Australia, they've huge investment in STEM, getting people into STEM, but only 15% of people coming out of STEM programs getting jobs, because cheaper resources are available from elsewhere. So perhaps they all need to go and join Entrepreneur First to create their own jobs. But I guess the question is, how do you advise high school students about deep tech in terms of, do you need to be really in the rocket science category to make a career out of it? And if you're not really in the top 10% or even lower or higher than that in terms of being able to get those research positions, should you be immediately, use that knowledge but then immediately flip over into more of an entrepreneurial and application type approach to what you're doing? Do you really, or do you even need those skills once you get to that certain level of commercialization where you can be anyone and start to take and develop those things?
This is an amazing Could everyone hear? Okay. It's a great question. I thought a lot about that, especially from my own experience, right? Was it useful to go through almost 10 years of education? And I'll be honest with you, I don't know. It's really hard to say. It's very hard to say because every person's story is different, right? So you can see cases where no, it wasn't, but you can see cases where it absolutely was. So it's very hard. If I were to talk to students, I also have to be careful not to fall into a cliche, something like, oh, you should love science and stuff like that. I think what is really important, let's think about quantum computing for a second. The theory behind quantum computing is extremely complex, so you don't improvise it. That's certainly true. It's very hard to improvise it. That said, the deep tech moment usually is brief, meaning that you have few years to capitalize on something which is uniquely yours, but then the rest of the world, let's just say, catches up. And even look at machine learning today, right? 2010, 2019 is very brief. Now you download TensorFlow, you use Keras, done. You are a machine learning expert. Did you have to go to school? Did you have to do 10 years of university? No. Do you understand the underlying theory? Maybe not. Does it matter? Maybe also not. The same will happen in quantum computing. So it's very hard, right? It really, I guess at the end of the day, it really depends where you as a person want to stand. Do you want to play a role at the beginning? You want to be at the forefront of a new technology, idea, movement, whatever there is? Then I don't think you can improvise. If you think, I like this story, right? If you think about Picasso, people usually think of Picasso, the painter, as somebody who didn't know how to paint because the things were like, square, very simple, very abstract. But if you go and look at the early works of Picasso, they are fantastic. I mean, the guy spent like decades perfectioning the drawing art. When he was the best at it, he said, okay, now that I know how to do that, I'll destroy it and create something new. But you need to be the best before you can do that. People just look at the final result, they're like, oh, everyone can do that. Yeah, that's not true. You need to understand inside out what you're doing before you can actually disrupt it. So if you think about it from that sense, then sure, I can see the value of a long education, very focused, etc. On the other hand, I have met, let's go back to the whole entrepreneur first experience. You meet people who are like 21, and these guys are fantastic. Like they have a lot of ideas, they're super sharp, super bright, they pick up what they need to, and they just do it. And they didn't really need to go through many, many years of research, postdocs, etc. So I think both paths are fine. It really depends what you want to do. It really depends on your approach. There's no right or wrong, usually. I think at the end of the day, it's motivation that really drives the person. I know this is easy to say, but it's also easy to say because it's true, intrinsically. It's a motivation that pushes you forward. You want to learn quantum physics, go for it. Keep in mind that the moment you're bored of it, if you're motivated enough, you can change and start a company or become an artist or whatever, because you have what drives you forward. I think this is maybe a nicer message to pass along to the students.
Okay, it's a quite difficult question to answer because there is, I think, no unique answer to it, or there is no unique advice for any students. Just if I want to think about my own experience, I decided to become a physicist when I was 16 years old. And maybe I was too young to decide to become a physicist, but I became a physicist, and it was my job for 10 years. After 10 years, I realized that, okay, I love physics, I still love physics, but academia and academic job now is not, in fact, resonating with what I am or who I am. So I would say that, first of all, basic sciences, pure sciences, I would say, are very, very good exercise, and they shouldn't be, in fact, eliminated or underestimated, in the value that they can add in training, in fact, our brain for harder problems. I always give this because I have also taught, in different levels, and I always tell my students that why do you go to gym? Why do you lift? Why do you exercise? It's not that you have to run every day. It's not that you have to lift every day. But if one day you have to solve a very difficult problem, then the math and physics education that you had, understanding that you had, has trained your brain in a way that can help you to find a way. So, I mean, somehow you may think that the path that I'm taking now, maybe the education that I had before may not be in direct use, but I believe that it had a very big role in building what I am now, my personality, and how I can, in fact, handle the problems. So I would say, to any student, I would say just be in touch with how you're feeling about what you're studying, if you're really enjoying it, if you're liking it, and don't be scared of change. Because for myself, I realized that this was, in fact, one of my weaknesses, that I was a bit scared of changing and moving out of academia, but so far I do not regret it. So on one hand, I mean, basic sciences, I cannot emphasize, I mean, how important they are, because these are just to train our brain. It doesn't matter what you want to do. Someone who knows math and physics is gonna, I mean, take better decisions if they have other type of educations, I mean, which other people have, but they have just this advantage that they know math and physics. I believe that they are more, I would say, they can think in a more logical way, and you can find different solutions to problems, and you can think differently. So for me, I mean, personally, maybe I'm very old school and very, but I would say the basic sciences should always be there, no matter what you want to end up as your occupation in the future.
I think getting to where you want to go is not always a straight line. Mine kind of was and got fuzzy at the end, you know, maybe there or not. But yeah, I think the student, when they start training, right, I agree with Shapna that, you know, it's not just about the material in the class, it's really to learn to get the knowledge, how to do it, meeting the right people, and so on and so forth, right? So networking and being able to communicate, you know, all the other skills. So I don't think it's really necessary to force yourself to go through a PhD just because you want to get into quantum computing, right? It's just that if you, yeah, like Tommaso said, you know, to sort of get a little sharp, push the boundary a little bit, it might take a lot, but of that education, the rigorous education, there's no going around that, I think. But I think there is a chance for younger people to come in, you know, and do something good, even if you don't later on, maybe like when it's more settled, but then the domain to make a big change might be smaller, but they will also find a way, I think, probably, if they're innovative enough.
Yeah, sure.
So to add on what Siwei just said, right? A few months ago, I received an email from he's 19 years old student from Queen's University in Canada. So he works with like a local machine learning group in the university. He sends me an email saying, oh, you know, I would love to have a chat. It's like a mini interview for their journal, whatever it was. I said, sure. So we set up the meeting. We speak in the morning. The guy is very excited. So we have the long conversation. At the end, he asked me, how can I learn about quantum computing? What can I do, right? This sounds fascinating. I really want to know a little more. Said, okay, of course. Send him a few links, a few articles, a few books that I think he should start reading. Gets back to me like a month and a half later and says, I've done this. Can you tell me something more? I was like, okay, right. So I give him a little bit more. And you would suspect that this is like graduate or postgraduate material, and in a way it is. But again, at some point, the guy was getting really into it, and then he sends me an email saying, you know what, I would love to do an internship with you guys. I'm like, okay. So we have a chat. My co-founder happened to be in Canada. They met, and then I asked him, how did it go? I was like, the guy is like, I don't know, he knows a lot. He just did it by himself. So now we are flying him from Canada. It was a bit tricky to get the visa, but it worked. And I think that really shows that at the end of the day, he's not an expert, right? You wouldn't consider him an expert. So what? Of course, he went through, you know, a very high-level education. He's at the university studying math, physics, machine learning, going back to what Shamnam just said. So that is important. But I also don't think it's the only thing that matters, of course.
Okay, maybe about one more question from the audience if we have one. Yeah?
If today you were assessing a startup, you wanted to do due diligence on where they are on quantum computing, what
Right. So what specific elements would our founders look at in a quantum computing startup if they were looking at it from a due diligence investment standpoint?
First thing, go to the board and show me that what you're saying can actually be done. It depends. Like, this is more of a maybe a physicist approach. It really depends. It depends on what they claim. It depends on what they want to do. But let's imagine a scenario where the main claim of the company is something similar to ours, if you like. We are doing something that no one else can do using this technology, et cetera, et cetera. Then you as an investor are in a tricky situation because it sounds very exciting, but then you also need to go out there and find, maybe you are an expert in quantum computing or in quantum physics, which is great, but if you're not, you need to find somebody who can assess what the people are saying. Keeping in mind that at our stage is really more about the team and the dream and the execution, et cetera, I think it's also important that if a company is playing on a deep tech, so if the angle, if the differentiation factor of the company is on the deep tech, one really needs to make sure that what they're promising or what they want to do is solid. Maybe it's impossible, right? And it's fair, I think, from our side to be not only fair, it's necessary from our side as funders to be super honest. We think this can be done, but we don't know that yet. And with your money, we're going to answer that. Can be done? Yes, no. From your side, what I think is very important, the first thing that you can do is to check the credentials of the funders. If they have experience in the field, I think that's a good sign. Then another thing that you can do, you should always ask them for references if you don't have any, or if you have, you should go out and ask the opinion of people who ideally are experts in the field. And I think it's also very important to have conversations between the founders and these people so that you're just not in the middle and hearing two different stories, which might be the same story, but just explained in a different way. Then at the end of the day, execution is very important. So if you can put your hands on something more tangible, if the founders of the company can show you even just a small example of what they're promising, and they're able to break it down and tell you exactly what is doing what and how they're using the technology, I think these are very good signs. I mean, I think this actually would go beyond what maybe most people do in due diligence for more traditional companies, which is fair, but I would go that way. I'm not being super nuanced, but this is, if I have to think on the top of my head, this is what I would do.
I guess I just have one thing to add. When Rigetti came out, I was like, oh, is this real? Are they really doing qubits? I looked at the credentials, but I also look at the papers of Rigetti, like Chad Rigetti, and see if he actually had some experience with spoken qubits. And I realized, oh, okay, actually, he had been at IBM at some point, and he was working on stuff. It's like, so maybe going beyond and looking at the papers too, because they sort of tell you the direction they might be taking later on and what kind of technicalities that he's capable of.
I personally love it when investors ask me, but like, do you have credentials? Can you actually show them? Especially it's amazing when they have a whiteboard in the office. Then it's fun.
Well, I don't have much to add, just to say that if everything is very nice and they're promising a lot and there is no problem there, then there is something wrong. So if they're honest with you and if they know what are the limitations and if they mention it and the challenges, but then if they still have some value to add, and but they also have some, as I said, they have some visions for further on when the hardware is improved, I would say at least they are realistic people who know what are the limitations and they're trying to add value, I mean, despite all these limitations. And so I would say that's the only thing that I would add.
Yeah, and I'll wrap that up with just the investors' side as well. And it ties back to, I think, the answer to the previous question as well. So having that one actual experience and that being, having the PhD in, quantum physics being quite important as a founder from that standpoint, so that you're sure that they understand the depth of the problem and the challenges. Maybe they use the exceptional 19-year-old who's willing to train himself and is super motivated, but I would find it difficult to, with this scale of problem, see that type of person as a founder. And at least from the founder standpoint, the credentials being very important, and their flexibility of their mindset. So a lot of the researchers that we work with, you know, they're very straight line research, research, research. And there is a certain amount of running and lifting that is required to then have the flexibility and the thinking to make that pivot out of research and recognize the completely other set of challenges that come with then building a business and actually taking things out to market. So just to wrap that up a little bit, I think that's also, you know, not groundbreaking news, but it's a lot of what I've kind of learned in going through some of the quantum space. One last question from the audience, if we can keep it quick, because I've got another just last one of my own, and then we'll break for networking. Okay, so that's going to be a difficult one to answer quickly. That's a very large question, but at least very, very briefly, and I would say especially in the context of what you're working on, what type of algorithms and are applicable with quantum computing in particular, and maybe a little touch on the data structures, and especially more importantly, what is the next breakthrough to look out for on the horizon that will especially enable what you're working on?
You love the horizon. Okay, I'll try to be super fast. I don't think short algorithm will ever be useful for anything. Take it, forget about it. Unsupervised learning, global problems, meaning any computation that you cannot parallelize. If you can parallelize it, you don't need quantum computing. If you can't parallelize it, you might need quantum computing. Unsupervised, I mentioned it, probabilistic. So probabilistic computations to give you an algorithm that wrap all these up. You can think of Boltzmann machines. I don't know if the word means anything to anyone, but it's like a kind of unsupervised network. Very similar in graphics to deep neural networks, but very different in spirit. Also very powerful and very highly unutilized in classical computing because it's hard to train. The next breakthrough that I think we're all looking forward to is the strong evidence for quantum advantage, meaning somebody has been able to prove that a problem was solved with a quantum computer, that a problem that will never be able to be addressed with a classical computer has been solved with a quantum computer. And I think we are reasonably close to that. To give time frame, I think in the next 2 years, maybe less, that is going to happen. And there is going to be really the point where there's no way back. If somebody solves a problem which is unique to quantum computing and you cannot solve with a classical computers, there's no way back, right? It means it works. And then there's only a way forward.
I'm just going to give a quick, cheat, partial answer. If you're interested in learning about quantum algorithms, Stephen Jordan has a algorithm zoo online that you can look up all the algorithms that have been understood and characterized online. If you are interested in near-term quantum computing algorithms, you Google like NISQ, N-I-S-Q, it's like noisy intermediate scale quantum computers, and you find the algorithms that come out there. So.
Okay, regarding the work that we have in fact chosen to work on, I mean the project that we have chosen to work on, since we want to work on systems which are actually quantum, you may not need much of translation, you know, because you're going to somehow map a quantum system onto a quantum system, but still because there are limitations in the hardware, I'm quite interested in variational quantum computings, where again you can make use of classical computers to somehow help you, to get the best out of whatever hardware is available now. What was interesting for me is that people started working, in fact, this was the other project that I was looking at before, but it's at the very earliest stages, is that people start inventing algorithms to solve classical problems, like, finite elements, like computational fluid dynamics, which are, classical problems which naturally you cannot map them into quantum computers, but people are, in fact, coming up with interesting algorithms which may not have any specific name. Some of them are combination of couple of methods to solve this kind of problems. But as, it was mentioned before, there is this really quantum algorithm zoo, right? And it's actually a zoo. It's quite a long list. So the people are getting really, I would say they're inventing new type of algorithms every now and then. But and as I said, people started making quantum computers to simulate quantum systems. But now they have realized that you can, in fact, simulate classical systems, which are hard to simulate with the classical computers. But then you need some new smart way of, in fact, building some algorithms to translate the classical problem into a quantum system, a quantum problem.
Okay, I think we'll go ahead and end it there, because it's a little bit time for networking and getting to meet everybody at the end, which I also find is one of the more valuable points to a lot of these evenings. So thank you very much to our panelists and for everybody who came tonight, and then the organization as well, along with EF and my colleagues from SGInnovate. So have a good evening, and look forward to speaking with a few of you afterwards.
Almost quantum computing irrelevant, because if they GPU in the machine learning, not for every problem, but for a lot of problems, they double in performance every 6 months roughly. So if you take 5 years, that gives you a lot of doubles.
This is why it was a good question. This is why before I was saying all the problems that you can parallelize, they are not good problems to parallelize.
Okay,
you can do exactly what you say. You just GPUs are cheap. FPGAs.
FPGAs.
So you can buy if you have money, you can buy as many as you want. You don't need a quantum computer for this problem. You need to look at problems that you cannot parallelize.